Welcome, everyone. Yeah, please help yourself to refreshments in the back. It's really a pleasure to be hosting the Managing for Climate Change seminar series being co-hosted by the Ecosystem Science and Sustainability Department, the Natural Resource Ecology Lab, and the North Central Climate Science Center. So it's really a collaborative effort between the federal agencies and the university. And we've had really, I think, an excellent slate of speakers so far. And it's really a pleasure for me to be introducing Bill Parton, who I've worked with for many decades now, and really have him kind of explore some of the climate interactions on some of the key ecosystems here in Colorado and surrounding areas in the Great Plains, and actually looking at these interconnections of our region to the broader Earth system. As part, Bill's research efforts here really comes at a blending of his roots in meteorology, where he started at Penn State University, continued in Oklahoma before coming to Colorado State University, and getting exposed to ecosystem science. He's one of the, I guess, several stars of ecosystem science that's never taken an ecology class. He's kind of learned by the seat of his pants, but really to a great benefit to how we view ecosystem sciences. And actually this talk is sort of for Bill really getting back to his roots, really looking at this interconnections between how the influences in the climate system impact the ecosystems, and looking at some of the feedbacks. And so with that, let me turn it over to Bill and his talk.
Right there. Okay. Whoops. No, there's that. You want it? We haven't got the first slide up. There we go. What? Not there yet.
Here we are.
All right, great. This slide, actually, I have to thank Susie Lutz for this, because the key part of what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a surprise to me, because 2 years ago, we were just starting analyzing some of our long-term plant production data from the shortgrass steppe. One of the cool things about the LTER site is that they have these long-term data sets. And one of them is this plant production data set. It goes from 1982 all the way to the present. So we have this long-term perspective. And as you'll see, we found some very almost like boundary changes in 1997. So it was like things changed. What's going on? And what that led to us investigating is how the potential for sea surface temperatures, on here to the right, the ocean, and how that basically affected the prairie. And we find, and I'll demonstrate, very strong connections of the climate in the Great Plains. In different regions have different connections to the climate, but we have a very strong connection of the climate to the sea surface temperatures. And it's not just the Pacific, which makes sense. Actually, we have the Pacific Decadal Oscillation pattern. We have the Atlantic pattern in the east of us. So, how is the Atlantic affecting our climate? But in fact, there are strong connections to the Atlantic sea surface temperatures. And then there's the ENSO pattern. So there are actually 3 different patterns in sea surface temperatures that actually have a connection to us in the middle of Colorado. So that's what we mainly talk about, is how we evolved to discovering this connection. And it's not just at one site, but the whole Great Plains. One of the big things that we did is basically use remote sensing data to do that. And so we derived with Bill Smith, took basically the NDVI data from the Great Plains, And we have it for all of the sites in the Great Plains. That's one of the strongest data sets. So we have continuous NDVI by county from 1982 to the present. And that's the data set that we're using to estimate what's happened in the Great Plains. The cool part is it's continuous. It's not like just one site for 1 year. We can look at the whole trends and how it's varied over time. So remote sensing data is a key part of what allowed us to do what we're able to do. And we will demonstrate the NDVI derived from remote sensing is a good correlate of plant productivity. So that was one of the key things. We first of all had to say, yes, does NDVI make any sense? We will show that it does. And the last part of my talk, sort of giving this ahead of time, is that we now have derived ways of making predictions for ranchers of what plant production is going to be in the spring. So our goal was to find out, are there techniques that we can say, it's April 1st, what's the probability of being drier than normal, wetter than normal? And so we're trying to develop tools so that ranchers can actually get an upfront warning about, is it warm or what's going to happen to plant productivity. And so that's a key thing. And the other key thing that it will demonstrate is that actual evapotranspiration, or rainfall in the spring, is highly correlated to plant productivity. So it is the most correlated to grassland production in most of the regions of the Great Plains. So the spring precip is really key. April, May, June, precip or precip stored during the winter from snow, those are the things that control production in most of the Great Plains grassland. So that's a key thing that we discovered. And so that's the thing when we look at climate change, how that changes is what really matters to production in our system. Okay, long-term, one of the things that we have, and I'll go through, is the long-term trends in the SGS, the shortgrass steppe, above ground plant production. We talked about that. We also have long-term data on NDVI. I talked about that from 1982. For the weather, we have data back to 1900. So we're able to reconstruct the actual evapotranspiration and the climate all the way back to 1900. So when we go back with these long-term sea surf temperature patterns, which go all the way back to 1900, we can link the two of those data sets together. The other data sets that we have is we actually have, using the DAYCENT model, simulated the basically ecosystem dynamics from 1900 to the present for including daily AET, daily soil water, daily plant production, all of the ecosystem things for all of the counties in the Great Plains. And we reconstructed what the basically paper in PNAS last year, we reconstructed the full greenhouse gas changes in that region over the whole time period. But this model run gave us all of the data that we can then use analysis to figure out what's going on in the ecosystem. We have the NDVI data from 82 to 2015, MODIS data more recently for some of the counties, and we have remote sensing plant production data that Bill Smith in a paper in Nature recently has derived globally, and we're using it locally in the Great Plains. So we have really big long-term data sets to play with. I'll talk about grassland above ground productivity and AET changing with sea surface temperatures, show you this connection, these correlations that we have derived. The three things that make a difference are the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. These are the sea surface temperatures off the west coast, and they can either be colder than normal or warmer than normal for 20 to 30-year periods. These are long-term oscillations, and it's not year-to-year changes. They stay either warmer or colder than normal for long time periods. Same thing's true for the Atlantic Multicadal Oscillation, the AMO, and that's a pattern with a 30 to 40-year pattern. I actually didn't know anything about the AMO until about 6 months ago, but we find that this is well connected potentially to the Great Plains. which is hard to believe given that it's way downstream of us. And then the ENSO pattern, which is the Central Pacific sea surface temperatures. And then the basically impact of climate on ANPP in the Great Plains. We'll look at how temperature and water impact the productivity and try to relate to how climate change, in theory, should affect plant production, grassland plant production in the Great Plains. You have one figure that if you extrapolated with changes in temperature and moisture from the GCMs, you in theory could say exactly how plant production should be changing. Okay, now let's look at the trends. The graph that first got our attention is this one up here in the top. And this is plant production from 1982 to 2014, or where we are now. If you look from 82 to 97, there's variance in NPP, but look what happened after that. I mean, all of a sudden it's a lot lower and the variance is extremely high. So basically I was saying, what happened in 97? You know, the time series certainly looks different. And if you look at Justin Durner, one of the authors, he had another data set out there, and basically you see the same pattern. So the things appear to be different before and after 97. And I thought, well, first of all, what's going on here? What happened in 97? Well, this is the transition period from the warm PDO to the cold PDO. And this is the year when we actually saw that happen in the ocean. All right, this is a reconstructed spring, April through June, actual evapotranspiration. So this is the actual water loss, but if you correlate that to rainfall, there's a very high correlation. So when I say AET, this is a better index of water loss, but it's really highly correlated to Precip. So you can use those two simultaneously. You look at the long time series. This was generated by the DAYCENT model with the observed weather data as input into it. So look at the warm period here, 77 through 97. You get variance, but you look at that compared to this cold period here. I mean, we were getting wetter than normal, way below normal, back and forth every other year, almost through that whole time period that we just came out of. So you can see this high variance in spring precip in water loss, and compare that to the warm period. You go back to the previous cold period, the 44 through 77, and you see the same pattern of high variance in AET. You go back to the 30s when we actually had all of the Dust Bowl, it was actually, again, less variable. So the thing that affected us is not so much the mean, but the variability. So the variability in these different time periods is really, really different. And I'll demonstrate basically how that affected the ecosystem. This is the integrated NDVI. So this is an indication, this is summing up all basically the greenness index for the whole growing season from April through October. And so you look at, this is even showing more of a radical change. These are the values from 82 through 97, really not changing much at all across that time period. Look what happened in 97, the variance, and in particular, a lot lower NDVI values. So clearly, it's a different time series. And again, this just reinforces the difference that I was talking about occurring and got our attention why we look at these long-term sea surface temperature patterns. This is above ground productivity versus integrated NDVI. This shows you our good correlation so that we can say most of the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking about NDVI, because NDVI is the thing we have continuous records of, and we can analyze over that time period, where we only have select plant productivity observations. So we can show that we get a good correlation of the plant production and NDVI. This also shows here cumulative NDVI versus cumulative AET for this same 82 to 94 time, or 2014 time period. And this is the best index that we get. This is cumulative April through June rainfall or PET. It's not a perfect correlation, and there are variances, but basically it's interesting that the biggest change is we go from 15 centimeters down to 5. We're above 15, we don't actually see much of a change in plant production with AET. So the biggest changes occur when we on the drier regions or drier times. All right, this slide basically shows the integrated NDVI, the actual NDVI versus time for 2 periods, the 92 to 97. This is the warm phase PDO. This is the nice phase, the good, or less variable, and actually higher productivity. So this is basically live biomass. So you might look at this and say that NDVI and live biomass, they're heavily correlated. We've demonstrated that. So you can see April going through July, we reach our peak NDVI, or peak live biomass, somewhere in June through early July. But it's that all of those 6 years in there, nice steady increase with the spring growth. You look at the most recent, or not the most recent, but 2000 to 2005, 3 of the years look like that, but 3 of the years are much, much lower, and much, much lower, particularly in the spring. So we had some of the largest droughts, actually 3 fairly substantial spring droughts. At the same time, we had 3 normal years. So this is what I'm talking about variability. You look at this time series and you can see virtually no change. And then here we can see what I'm talking about and why we see so much variability. So if you're a rancher, you're pretty happy in this time series. Guaranteed biomass, you know what's going to come, and it's been the same every year, year after year. Not this time series. You've got some of the worst droughts and then some of the normal years mixed in. So much more variance. If you take the NDVI data for the 2 time periods, 99 through 2013, which is the cold time period, and 82 to 98, which is that warm period, the positive time period, and you plot the mean NDVI versus time, you can see, and then look at the standard deviation. You see the blue line, the warm period, we have the normal pattern of peak values in June, but then look at the standard deviation. It's really quite low. So that, I mean, there are months where it's a little higher, but you compare that with our most recent period and look at the standard deviation in the peak of the year. The standard deviations are 2 or 3 times higher for any given time in the middle of the year. So these are the droughts mixed in with the normal years. So it shows you, if you're a rancher, you don't know what you're going to get from one year to the next in the live plant biomass. And this demonstrates that for the whole time period. This one is basically to demonstrate we correlated above ground productivity observed at the shortgrass steppe site out here, eastern Colorado, versus the cumulative actual evapotranspiration, and then we get these correlations. There is some evidence that if you have a really big drought the year before, you see plant production not responding as much as you would expect. And actually that seemed to show up in actually 3 of the years in the early 2000s. So part of the reason we don't see the response to precip is that you might have lag effects from the previous year. So productivity isn't only controlled by current precip, it's controlled by other factors too, like previous year's precip. So again, just to show that AET is a very important variable for plant productivity. Without this data set, we couldn't ever be able to document that. This is actually similar to one I showed you earlier. One key thing though, which was interesting, if you look in the 1910 to 1920, you see the wettest conditions in the whole time period occurred then. This is when we plot out the Great Plains, and the farmers were happy and they said, wow, we've got a good place to grow. But look at what happened after that time period. So this is when we went into the 30s. I mean, substantially, almost half the productivity, half the AET than we had in that earlier time period. So they're a little deceived by looking at the climate in that time period. One of the things that's interesting is that the temperature seems to follow these PDO patterns also. 20s were cold, or I'm sorry, the early 10 to 1920. This is the 30s during the Dust Bowl. It got a lot hotter, clearly a lot hotter than that older period. We went into the cold phase PDO from 44 to 77. You see actually a temperature decrease. Then you look at the most recent time period, you look at the temperature going way up in this warm phase one. And then we see again a cooling during our most recent cool phase. So temperatures on average in the shortgrass steppe anyway, have not gone up during the last 15 years. The real warmest temperatures occurred actually during the warm phase. So you see temperature is actually following a pattern also during this time period. And if you look at the global temperature patterns, this also occurs. You see a warming through that whole time period, but the biggest warming occurred before 44. You actually saw decreases in global temperature, and then big increases in this period, and then not much increase from 97. So the sea surface temperatures also impact the global air temperatures. All right, the DAYCENT model was compared with the observed. We have like 10 years of daily actual evapotranspiration data, lots of long data sets to test the model. This is just 1 year showing daily observed AET and modeled. We do a pretty good job. If you aggregate it at weekly and monthly time scales and compare model versus data, we even do better. I mean, on a monthly time steps, we're almost up to 0.9 R-squareds. So when we use our model results, we can say, yes, these are likely to be well representing history because we have 10 years of data to show that the model is really working. We also simulate soil water quite well with the model. We have extensive data sets to show that. So the model is generating the ecosystem dynamics quite well given our observed data sets. We also have looked at the net carbon exchange, which we don't do as well with. But one of the things that's key, this is from the shortgrass steppe, and the net carbon exchange based with eddy covariance data. The key thing, positive means there's a net carbon uptake, negative means there's a loss. Most of the net carbon uptake in the shortgrass steppe occurs in the May through a June period. And this is typical. We have 6 years of data, and this is identical pattern that you only really get net carbon uptake in our grasslands primarily in the early part of the growing season. You look at the end of the growing season from July through October, there's more, it's neutral or negative. But one of the cool things that we discovered in a paper that we published a few years ago is right after every rain event, you see a negative. These are the observations, these lines here, and every rain event you see a loss of carbon, and particularly later in the season. So you actually have more net carbon loss following rain events in the summer than you do all of the rest of the winter. So these rain events in the summer, basically the microbes go crazy. For 2 days after a rain event, they just lose lots of carbon. And the plants do better, but not near as well as the microbes. So these pulse rain events are very important for the net carbon exchange in the ecosystem. All right, what does the pattern of PDO look like? So this is going back to 1900 to 2014 here. Basically, the red lines, again, we sort of reverse the scale here. The red is hot and the blue is cold. You can see the 20s through the 40s, a tendency, most of it being warm. Here's that cold period from the 40s through the 70s. This is the recent warm period. And then we have a tendency for the cold from 97 on. But there is some variance between years, but it's really the trend over those periods. We are looking at how this variance might affect and maybe be correlated to productivity. This over here in the warm phase, this is the mean sea surface temperatures during that 78 through 98 time period. You can see warmer temperatures off the west coast of the US, colder ones in the Pacific there. And so on average, this is what you're seeing. If you look at the cold phase, you can see the opposite is true. It's completely inverse of the temperatures with the cold values all the way out to the central Pacific and the west coast. And this is what happened recently. We shifted back to the warm phase PDO. And this was one of the warmest ever observed in sea surface temperatures. We've got climate change on top of this. So the cool thing is we have sea surface temperatures following a 20 or 30-year pattern, and then climate change adding on top of that. So that makes it sort of hard to predict the future because things are changing on the trend. But if you're talking about doing trend analysis, you got to realize there's this 20 or 30-year pattern that could be driving you either cold above or below. You got to subtract that out if you want to look at climate change. So, all right, so you can see these are big changes over longer time periods. This is the AMO, which is the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. It's actually much more homogeneous, and it's got a pretty steady 30-year cycle. You can see that. So you compare that with the PDO, which has somewhat more oscillations, and we actually find that the phase, you can actually be out of phase. You can have different phases. You can be a warm, cold, a cold, warm. All of the different combinations can occur. Where we were, the last warm was the 30s, which is a little bit worrisome for the Great Plains, because we know that a lot of the Great Plains had some substantial low productivity during that time. So historically, we're headed towards the warm period, or we're in it right now. But these are not perfectly in cycle, so you can get all of the combinations of them. But we've actually only had one warm period since 1900. So we haven't had any replication during that time. Okay, this is 1977-98. This is the frequency of droughts. And so a blue number means low frequency. And so this is, I'm saying the prime period. We're talking about the warm phase period. And you look at the frequency of droughts, this low number, so the Great Plains were great, low frequency of droughts during that time period, except in the northern Great Plains where it was actually more droughty. So you'll find that the northern Great Plains and the southern Great Plains behave differently. It's like inverse. If one's great, the other is going to be the opposite pattern. This is what we had recently. And that's why it's been great in the Great Plains before the change. You look at what happened from 99 to 2013. Look at this. This is the opposite. High frequency of drought, particularly in the Southwest and into Colorado. And but again, the northern Great Plains, not necessarily wetter than normal, but certainly not drier than normal. So again, this inverse pattern. And then if you look at, this is what the current pattern is, and it's the same as the 30s. And you know, this would be the prediction based on history about what would happen. So it'd be great in the Southwest, but the northern region should have a lot more droughts based on history. So this is not necessarily a good, Colorado is interesting because Colorado is right at the boundary. And actually what's happening, I think, you know, where that boundary is is hard to predict, because this is what happened in the 30s. That doesn't mean it's going to happen now. But Colorado is the hardest because we're right at that boundary between the region which is correlated one way or the other, where we have strong correlation. And in reality, since we've shifted, we've had 3 of the best years for plant production. So it's been good since we had the transition. All right. We evaluated the patterns of, this cool versus the warm period. We wanted to see at the ecosystem level what happened at the whole Great Plains. I talked about what happened in the shortgrass steppe, but okay, let's look at the whole region. So what we did is do the ratio for the mean values of AET derived by the DAYCENT model. And we did the mean spring evapotranspiration for the cool PDO. It's actually from 77 to 97, not this time period, divided by the warm phase. So we looked at the mean values of AET and the mean values of annual production, cool divided by warm. So if it's cold, if it's blue, that means that you're below normal during the cold phase. And if it's red, it means it's above normal during the cold phase. So this is based on model results with observed weather data, again showing drier than normal conditions in the southwest and the normal to somewhat above normal conditions in the northern Great Plains. Now this is satellite derived of plant production with the same time period. And you look down here, you see the blues, so the lower normal production during this drier time period. And then you look up here, and the northern Great Plains had a great time. I mean, these red ones are much above productivity during that time period, the cool versus the warm. So we see this time period, we get completely different responses to the different PDO periods. And that's true all the way through. Is that in Colorado, again, you look here in the middle, we're sort of in that transition zone. So we're in a tough place to make forecasts because we have patterns that are really highly correlated on either end, on the north or the south. But in the middle, it's a much tougher, we're at that transition between the two. Now, this graph is all about variability. So it's the same ratio, cool to warm time period. And a red one means it'd be more variable and a blue means less variable. So if you look at AET, the actual spring evaporation, as we demonstrated at the shortgrass steppe, which is right here, but the whole central Great Plains is more variable during the cool phase. You can see this whole region from eastern Colorado into Kansas. So it's not just our little site here, this whole Great Plains is actually showing this variability being higher during the cold phase. And if you look at the satellite-derived plant production in the variability, the same index, you can see, again, the central Great Plains all the way, I mean, you can see from the mountains all the way into much of Kansas, we have this high variability, which is really correlated to the high variability in precipitation. So the central Great Plains are correlated to variability, not necessarily to the means. So each different regions have different responses to these sea surface temperature patterns. All right, so basically we have several data sets to show, we wanted to look at the regional patterns in plant production in the Great Plains. And we have data from the NRCS, which has, at each county has the plant production, and I'll show you that data set. We wanted to demonstrate that the NDVI values we got are correlated to plant productivity. Down here in this lower diagram, we correlated annual NPP observed at all of these sites in the Great Plains with cumulative NDVI for the year. And we get a regression that greater than 0.8 R-squares to show that plant production and NDVI are correlated. In this one, we correlated the NDVI, cumulative average NDVI versus the average NPP from NRCS, and again, we get a good relationship, though there's more variance. But this is basically for the whole region, the plant production, where this is from select sites. These are the maps we get for plant production. Oh, I'm sorry, no, these are the maps of the climate, just to show you so you realize what we're looking at. Basically, southern Great Plains, it's hotter, obviously, and then it gets cold. So you get mostly a continuous gradient of decreasing temperature, where precip basically has an east-west pattern, but it's actually lower precip in the northern Great Plains than the southern Great Plains, maybe half, basically. There's this pattern of east-west and a north-south drop. So this is what pattern we have. Let's look at the plant production based on the NRCS observed values and then our NDVI base values. And you can see basically it's the same pattern. But what we find is this strong east-west pattern throughout the whole region, with a tendency for higher plant productivities actually in eastern, south, and North Dakota, shown in both of the data sets. Yeah?
Is this during the cool or the warm decadal oscillation, or is it across both?
This is across the whole time period, yeah. Yeah, these were derived for a 40-year period, yeah, for the whole time period. So it actually includes both of those. Yeah, we don't have a time series of, these are averaged, right? Okay, one of the things we found is we did the 30-year cumulative growing season NDVI. So this is, NDVI is NPP. And then we correlated that with the mean 30-year AET, April through July. In the three regions, the lowest one, the yellow here, or the orange, is the southern, green is the central, and then the northern Great Plains. And Melanie and I, we plotted these, it was not too long ago, we were looking at it. We published a paper with Osvaldo Sala about 20 years ago that showed that these should have all been on one line. But when we use our more refined data set, the northern Great Plains is really different, and it's because of the colder temperatures. So the less water stress because of colder temperatures, you get much more, you might say, rainfall use efficiency. Because here's what you're talking about, much more production for the same rainfall. Not that much of a difference in the central and the south, but when you go farther north, you can see you're getting 30 to 40% more production for the same rainfall. So that's this climate difference across the Great Plains. Even though you have less rainfall up there, you're much more efficient. So this difference between the Great Plains, you obviously can't treat it the same way. These are different regions because of the temperature primarily. And this one just demonstrates how different it is dramatically in one figure. Let's see. I think I'll go forward. But basically, we wanted to look at how the slope of the precip line, so it's productivity versus rainfall on an annual basis versus on the mean across the whole region. And what we found is that a key thing is that the slope of the response to precip is less than it is if you cross the mean. So if you go from a site to site to site where you change mean precip and look at how it changed versus how it changed on an annual basis, you find that the slope of the response to precip is a lot less than it is if you look at the mean. What that means is that if you get more precip than normal, you don't get the productivity you would get if you moved to a higher productivity sites. But the other thing is, if you have lower than normal precip, you get more productivity than you would if you had a lower productivity site. So it's comparing the mean versus the variance. And basically you see that throughout the whole Great Plains. One of the cool things that we found is that when we looked at the slope of the regression of productivity to rainfall, so it's if you have a bigger slope, means there's more response to precip. So a high slope means, yes, you get a big change in productivity to a change in precip. A low slope means really little response to precip on an annual basis. So it's a year-to-year change. what we found, and we stratified the data for different precip amounts. So the red and these black ones are for dry sites, and then the green and the blue are for wet sites, high values of precipitation. We get completely different patterns as you change temperature. So on the x-axis, we have temperature. So if you go from dry sites and you get hotter, you actually get less of a response to year-to-year changes in precip. Where the other pattern is completely different. You actually get more of a change, more of a slope, and more of a response in the wet sites. So it's really different in the different regions. The important climate change consequence of this is if we increase the temperature, if you're in the dry sites in the Western Great Plains, you're going to see less year-to-year increase in productivity or change in productivity as you change the rainfall. Where if you're in the eastern part of the Great Plains, you're going to see more variability as you change precip across years. So you can see different responses to changes in temperature based on this analysis of the whole Great Plains. This figure right here sort of has the whole Great Plains aggregated in one place. This has basically mean NDVI is a function of temperature on the x-axis and then different precipitation amounts. So the blue is the highest and then this orange is the lowest. Clearly, the more precip you have, the more productivity. That's not surprising. But then you look at the effect of temperature. So you get a consistent pattern of decreased productivity with increasing temperature. So you could take this figure and just put a climate change scenario on it, and you could say what would happen in 100 years with the Great Plains if you were at equilibrium. So basically, you increase the temperature everywhere in the Great Plains, you're going to see a decrease in the mean productivity based on this data. All right, ways to simulate seasonal above ground productivity. One of them is to look at the PDO AMO pattern. So you look at what it is like in the spring. So which zone of PDO and AMO are we in? And look at the correlations. Basically, another one we found that's really exciting is that the spring NDVI values using MODIS are highly correlated to the integrated value or the plant production for the whole year. So in May 15th, I can give you a forecast. If I know what NDVI is, I can tell you what production is. I'll show you that. And then the other thing is we can use the DAYCENT model to simulate AET using observed productivity and then precipitation weather forecasts. So if we forecast what's going to happen, use the model to predict, then we could use our correlations and make some predictions. This just shows you that we get really big differences in productivity predicted in the different phases of PDO and AMO. But this is just showing the potential to forecast ahead of time what's going to happen. We don't want to focus on that. This one is showing you the integrated NDVI in the spring value on April 20th, April 26th versus the integrated value. So this is NPP. And if you look at April 26th, there's not much prediction. May 4th, you've gone to 0.5 R-squares to predict what the seasonal value will be. You look at it on May 12th, you're up to 0.64 R-squares. So if you're down here at 0.2 NDVI on that date, it didn't get any better. Historically, it hasn't happened. And the later you get, the higher these correlations. So we could use these as forecast tools for ranchers. These are really pretty high correlations. We were surprised. So spring NDVI values seem to be pretty well correlated to what's going to happen at the end of the season. And the later you get, the better your forecast. Predicting season NPP. Okay, basically we can use the forecast model, the century model, to predict what AET is going to be. If we know what the current weather is and weather forecast, then we can make forecasts. So that's another way we go for it. And the correlations that we use are the ones that we derive at a county level. This is for a county in western Nebraska, for example, a dry county. if you know what AET is, then you can predict what the season-long value will be. And how well we can forecast that depends on our weather forecast, which obviously have concerns. But this is in a way we can go forward. Basically, the dry sites are going to be more predictive than the wet sites. Wet sites are not going to be work as well. All right, summary. Basically, SGS site, there's a strong correlation between PDO and above ground productivity, more variability in AEP and AET with a negative PDO. So when we're in the negative phase, it's much more variable. Not necessarily drier, but it's definitely more variable. In the northern Great Plains, for the cold PDO, we actually are above productivity, higher productivity. The southern Great Plains, it's below. So different regions are responding in a different way, but definite connections to the PDO phase. Increases with increasing AET and decreases with increasing growing season. So above ground, basically the water use efficiency in the northeast, in the northern Great Plains is higher because of the lower temperatures and higher humidity. So the temperature really interacts with that, and the slope of the curve for the dry sites, the response to precip is going to be different if you're dry or wet. You're going to, in one case, have more variability, and in the other case, less variability. And we can use our results potentially to project what climate change would be that Dennis is interested in. If we put climate change scenarios in that one graph of mine, we could make all kinds of predictions about what's going to happen. Thanks.
I'm sure there's plenty of questions about patterns, Bill.
Any idea about what climate change, what effect that might have on these decadal oscillations?
Yeah, as you saw, the sea surface temperatures that we saw most recently in the warm is the warmest ever. And so as to whether those frequency would change or not, we can't predict them at the moment. And then the GCM models, I think, you only have 4 cycles to reproduce. So, I mean, think of that in terms of a model. You don't have a lot. When you look at the long trends, we really only have 4 in the last 100 years. So warm, cold, warm, cold. That makes it hard statistically. But, yeah. Yeah.
So I love this. It makes perfect sense. And it basically says that dry areas are probably going to get drier and less predictable. But let's say that I'm a rancher and I want to put my cattle on the range. Is April too late to make decisions about those kinds of activities?
Yeah, well, those are the kind of things we're working with Justin Turner on this. And so one of the things we're going to do with this project, that Justin has funded us to work on this, and we're working with Dennis on this too, is he has 30 sets of 30 ranchers that he works extensively with. And so that's what we're going to do, is work with them and ask that exact question. You know, if I can tell you in May 15th or early May that you've got a 80% chance of being dry, you know, how can you use that information? What's really most useful? Beginning of April, we can't say anything in April, but we can say things in May. And how well the weather forecasts are of, you know, whether it's going to be drier or normal during that April, May, June. They do make forecasts like that, but we don't know how good they are is going to make a difference on how well we can forecast. So, yeah, but the way we're going to solve that, or at least get at that, is to work with specific ranchers before we say, okay, we're going to put it out there for everybody. That we want to narrow and figure out what people will use and what they find useful. Yeah.
Now, during the warm and cold PDO cycles, how does the rainfall change?
Well, basically, the rainfall is changing as I've shown, but basically in the southern Great Plains during the cold phase PDOs, it is drier than normal. I mean, it's reliably drier than normal. And in the northern Great Plains, it's consistently above normal. In the middle, it's sort of on average, it's not necessarily that different, but it's a lot more variable. So it's like the different regions have completely different responses, the south and the north, and then the central doesn't necessarily have a big mean change in precip, but it does have a big change in variability.
You said productivity is higher during the warm period.
Yes, that's right.
So
For
that-
the southern Great Plains.
Probably higher temperature, but also higher rain.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the recent warm phase was a very good time period, wet over big areas of the Great Plains, and higher productivity.
And attest to this, this set of hypotheses that the last 3 years has been that transition into a warm phase of the PDO. And so that's also part of the stimulation behind this research, is that now we're entering into a new period, and we're going to begin tracking to see will the meteorology change. The connection between the AMO and PDO too, you can see it, sort of think about at on either side of the continent. When you have high pressure areas, warm phases of PDO and AMO, then you have sort of a blocking pattern on the east, which is influencing the jet stream. Right. And so a lot of this is sort of looking at the large scale circulation and jet stream patterns and what's happening to then the winter precip that comes in and sets up the, how much moisture we get. And so those are some of the emergent patterns that we're seeing, the teleconnections between what happens in the Pacific and the controlling amplification of, the type of how deep the cold polar winds come down into the central part of the United States, which is influencing the Great Plains.
And the other thing, a recent paper I just was reviewing yesterday is the ENSO, the El Nino La Nina pattern interacts with the PDO. Basically, if you get a warm phase, the El Nino on top of a warm phase PDO, you get a big response. You get the opposite if you have the La Nina, a cold phase on top of a warm phase, that de-amplifies the effect of the PDO. So, I think we have a three-dimensional thing here with ENSO, PDO, and AMO, and we're going to try to pull that apart statistically. So maybe we'll be able to say, I'm in this phase of ENSO, this phase of PDO this year, and this AMO, and look at the correlation and see if there's anything we could then say. Then we could say in April, because I'll know that in April, this is the likely pattern, or there isn't any pattern. So in theory, we have a lot more data if you look at year to year to year rather than 4 cycles. We can actually look at that on a yearly basis, and some of the that's where we're headed to making better forecasts, and we could do that early on.
So a wild card in this whole forecasting effort, though, is that the assumption is that the past is a good predictor and analog for the future. And we're seeing things in the Earth system now that actually is going to break down those correlations. In particular, the freshwater infusion to North Atlantic. So as the polar ocean becomes warmer, less ice covered, you're seeing influx of fresh water from Greenland into Northern Atlantic. The implications of that on the AMO is a wild card. We don't know. And so there are things that, even though we have some predictability on the past conditions, whether those past conditions will be reflected into the future or projected to actually manifesting themselves in that particular way, we don't really know. And climatologists and our colleagues who study this stuff for a living are kind of looking into that with their models.
A key thing, though, is if you were in the Southern Great Plains and looking at plant production trends from the 70s to the current time period, you're going to see a pattern that looked pretty bad. It was really nice, and it got worse. Is that climate change? No, it's PDO. And in the Northern Great Plains, it was the opposite. You had dry and then wet. So if you don't extract these larger scale PDO cycles from what you're seeing, you know, you're going to get a really strange signal and the wrong interpretation. So that's what's new about what we're talking about, is people haven't necessarily been trying to extract these long-term cycles from the short term.
Like you said in response to the question, that we don't know the connection between climate change and PDO.
Correct.
Still,
Yes.
Love to talk. I like seeing all those concepts displayed, but you did them almost all with bivariate models. And so a question I have is, have you considered multivariate statistics to help you describe some of these complex relationships with a number of drivers?
Yeah, we have looked at, well, we've mainly focused on the Precip effect and not so much the temperature. We have all of that data in our stats, but it's sort of, we have this big data set. It's sort of like a big data because we have the whole Great Plains, all of that time period from 1900 on with, in the NDVI from the recent time periods, and with all the weather and observed data. So that's what we want to get into, is more looking at all of that. And I guess I don't see a lot of, intuitively, I don't see the temperature interacts with that. I mean, the warmest temperatures occurred during that warm, when we had the nice precip period and low variability. So I guess I don't see that temperature is likely to make much difference, but we haven't evaluated all of those combinations. So we need a good statistician with a big data set. We have the data set. Well, let's go for it.
So thanks, Bill. I think we should give Bill another. So next week we continue sort of in this series, but sort of switch back to looking at a slightly different topic, or a very different topic, looking at public health, looking at sort of climate influences on vulnerable communities and its impacts on populations and public health issues. Chris Ebi, who's been part of the IPCC technical working group, support group for the IPCC working group 2, will be our speaker next week. Thanks.
Yeah.